In the spring of 1895, a quiet Boston neighborhood was shattered by the disappearance of a bright and innocent little girl. What began as a desperate search soon unraveled into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking murder cases of the 19th century. This is the tragic story of Alice Sterling and the man accused of ending her young life. Stay with me, because what follows is a case that shook a city, tested the limits of justice, and left a family forever broken. Today, we're stepping back to the very end of the 19th century, so settle in as we head straight to Boston, Massachusetts. Alice Sterling came into the world in 1887. She was the second youngest of 6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys, born to George and Alice Sterling. The family lived at 47 Savin Hill Avenue in a modest but warm home. George supported them with his own barber shop just down the road at 1120 Dorchester Avenue, while Mrs. Sterling kept the household running. Life for the Sterlings was simple, but filled with togetherness. In the late afternoons, they often went for family walks. Evenings were spent reading together, and Sundays, without fail, were reserved for church. Boston itself was buzzing with change during Alice's early years. Electric streetcars had just been introduced in 1889, making it easier than ever to move around the city. Iconic landmarks like the Boston Common and the State House stood proudly as industry and education flourished. By 1895, the city had begun construction on the Tremont Street subway, one of the very first subway systems in the entire United States. This ambitious project aimed to ease traffic downtown by taking streetcars underground, marking Boston as a true pioneer in modern transportation. Of course, for young Alice and her siblings, these innovations weren't front of mind. Their world was much smaller. School, playtime with friends, and the little joys of childhood. Most days were filled with games in the neighborhood and endless adventures around their surroundings. It was early Wednesday morning, April 10th, 1895, when Mrs. Sterling set out for Everett to visit her sister, about 6 miles away. Little Alice stayed behind with her father, spending the day near his barber shop while he worked with a steady stream of customers. Alice was a cheerful, lively child, well known and loved throughout the neighborhood. While she mostly played outside, her father always kept a careful eye on her through the shop window. She adored her doll, and though she wasn't yet steady on it, she also enjoyed trying to ride her bicycle. From time to time she'd wander back inside the shop, where everyone knew her by name and always greeted her warmly. But around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Mr. Sterling looked out and realized Alice was gone. At first, he assumed she had wandered off only a short distance. But as the minutes stretched on, his worry began to grow. He hurried back to their home, hoping she'd returned there. But she hadn't. His unease deepened into real fear. When Mrs. Sterling returned home later, the family launched a desperate search. With their 3 daughters and 2 sons, they went door to door, asking neighbors and friends if anyone had seen Alice. No one had. Mrs. Sterling flagged down a local officer, Patrolman Perkins, who immediately joined the search. When their efforts turned up nothing, Perkins alerted his superiors, and the police quickly took action. In the 1890s, a missing child was treated as a grave emergency. Investigators spread across the area, interviewing witnesses and searching the streets. Alice's description was circulated citywide. Police scoured the waterfronts of South Boston and Dorchester, but there was still no sign of the little girl. Then a glimmer of hope. A witness came forward claiming they'd seen Alice walking along Savin Hill Avenue with a man. He was described as tall and heavy-set. The girl, they said, didn't appear distressed. She looked calm in his company. Authorities released Alice's full description to every newspaper. She was small for her age, with a fair complexion and a distinctive birthmark above her eyebrow. When last seen, she wore a broad-brimmed brown felt hat, a matching brown dress, and black stockings. Despite the police efforts, George and Alice Sterling were overcome with fear. Their little girl had vanished, and each passing hour only deepened the dread that something terrible had happened. As police dug deeper, New witnesses began to come forward with crucial details. One woman, Mrs. Tupper, reported that around 3 o'clock on the very day Alice disappeared, she had seen a man walking hand in hand with a young girl along Savinhill Avenue. She later spotted them again, first at the corner of Oakland Street, then further down near Midland Street. Another neighbor, Mrs. Harding, recalled seeing a man and a little girl heading in the direction of the railroad depot. But the most important sighting came from a railroad employee, Mr. J.T. Loring. He told investigators that he had seen Alice with a man he immediately recognized, someone he knew personally. The man's name was Angus Gilbert. Loring said what struck him most was that Gilbert didn't acknowledge him at all. This was unusual, since the two normally worked side by side at the depot in the evenings. So who was Angus Gilbert? Gilbert was a 28-year-old immigrant from Nova Scotia, Canada. He worked as a handyman on the Emmons estate in Dorchester, where his days were filled with heavy physical labor, chopping wood, hauling water, and taking on whatever odd jobs needed doing. In return, he was given a modest wage along with food and shelter. But his work didn't stop there. At night, Gilbert held a second job as an assistant station agent at the railroad depot. His living quarters were just as humble as his lifestyle, a small room in the barn on the Emmons property. The barn itself, once full of animals and activity, had long since fallen quiet. Still, Gilbert managed to make his little corner of it comfortable enough to call home. When Officer Perkins learned about Gilbert's living arrangements, a chilling thought began to take shape. What if Gilbert had led Alice to that barn, taking a back way to avoid being seen? The barn was remote, close to his daily work, and isolated enough that he could keep a child hidden without attracting immediate suspicion. By Saturday, April 13th, just 3 days after Alice vanished, Perkins was convinced. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, he approached Gilbert to make the arrest. The two men knew each other fairly well, and when Perkins informed him he was under arrest, Gilbert didn't panic. He stayed calm, insisting he knew nothing about Alice's disappearance. Still, he was taken straight to the police station. With Gilbert in custody, Officers Perkins and Smith returned to the barn to search. Inside his room, they made disturbing discoveries: empty whiskey bottles, bloody handkerchiefs, and a pair of trousers that matched the description of those worn by the man last seen with Alice. The pants, neatly folded, appeared to be stained with blood. The search then shifted to the cellar. At first, Perkins dug through a pile of manure but found nothing. Moving on, he pressed his boots against the ground near a partition and felt something soft beneath the earth. He began to dig. Within moments, he unearthed a pair of tiny button boots. Then, horror, a child's leg appeared. Perkins dug faster, his worst fear now undeniable. Buried face down in the shallow grave was the body of a young girl. Her clothing matched perfectly with what Alice Sterling had been wearing the day she disappeared. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire. Soon, crowds gathered outside the barn, but Captain Merrick and his officers held them back, securing the scene as a heavy silence fell over the property. A doctor was called in to examine the remains. The body lay undisturbed where it had been buried, but the injuries were clear. The left side of Alice's head had been brutally crushed, and a large, grotesque swelling stood out above her right eye. At first, medical examiner Draper believed the wounds might have been caused by one of the heavy stones found nearby. But that theory quickly fell apart. During a sweep of the barn's upper level, Officer Dinsmore uncovered something far more telling: a large axe. On closer inspection, blood was smeared across the blade, and clinging to it were strands of hair the exact same color as Alice's. Dr. Draper had the axe carefully wrapped and sent to Harvard, where Professor Woods would conduct a detailed forensic analysis. Meanwhile, the post-mortem examination brought a devastating confirmation: Alice had been abused before she was murdered. When police delivered the news to the Sterling family, their home was overcome with grief. The atmosphere grew unbearably heavy. As the reality sank in, Officer Perkins entered the house to find George Sterling holding his daughter Gertie, trying to soothe her cries. The other children sat nearby, sobbing quietly. Their youngest, only 4 years old, wandered the rooms with a look of confusion, far too young to understand the tragedy that had just torn her family apart. In another room, Mrs. Sterling lay in a fragile state. The shock of her daughter's death was so overwhelming that she collapsed and required a doctor's care. Through it all, George Sterling managed to hold himself together, though his voice trembled as he spoke to officers. "I cannot understand how anyone could commit such a terrible act," he said. "I don't have enemies, at least none that I know of. When Alice first went missing, I held on to the hope that maybe she'd been taken for ransom. She was such a bright, beloved child. But to think she was murdered, it's beyond anything I can comprehend." Investigators wasted no time questioning Angus Gilbert, pressing him for his version of what happened on Wednesday, April 10th. Gilbert told them that around 3 o'clock that afternoon he had been at the barber shop. From there, he claimed he went straight to Mrs. M's house on Savin Hill Avenue, where he stayed alone until dinner at 6. By 7, he insisted, he was already at his job at the railroad station. Yes, he admitted seeing Alice in the barbershop earlier that day, but he denied having anything to do with her disappearance. Hoping to shake his composure, police brought Gilbert back to the barn and even to the very spot where Alice's body had been buried. Yet, his face remained cold and unreadable. He continued to insist he was innocent. He told officers that he had known the Sterling family for about 4 years and often visited their home. He considered George Sterling a good friend, he said, and would never harm any of his children. Until then, Gilbert had no criminal record. Police found nothing in their files against him. Many who knew him described him as a hard-working man, though one with flaws. He enjoyed drinking and was known to be overly talkative with young women, especially at the railroad station. His past painted him as an ordinary man. Born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, his parents were well respected in their community. His father still lived there, though his mother had died when Angus was just 19. After her death, he came to Boston, joining his sister Jenny, who had moved there years earlier. He wasn't known for having close friendships, but the few friends he did keep were regarded as decent and respectable. Despite all of this, Gilbert continued to deny murdering Alice. He admitted his memory of April 10th was hazy, blaming it on drinking, but insisted he had not killed the little girl. But as police confronted him with witness statements, people who swore they had seen him walking with Alice, his story suddenly shifted. Gilbert now claimed that on the morning of Thursday, April 11th, he had gone into the barn cellar to fetch a pitchfork. There, he said, he stumbled upon Alice's body. Panicked, terrified he'd be blamed for her death, he buried her instead of telling anyone. Looking back, he admitted he should have spoken up immediately, but he maintained his innocence, swearing he hadn't killed her. The police didn't buy it. His story only deepened their suspicions. Soon after, Angus Gilbert was officially charged with the murder of Alice Sterling. The trial of Angus Gilbert opened on Monday, June 24, 1895, in the Superior Criminal Court of Sussex County, before Judges Dunbar and Sheldon. The atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed wall to wall with curious spectators and eager journalists, each straining for a view of the accused. Outside, crowds pushed and jostled for a chance to squeeze inside and witness the proceedings themselves. When Gilbert entered, he was sharply dressed in a dark blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a light blue tie, an appearance carefully chosen, perhaps, to soften the public's perception of him. But his polished look did little to ease the tension in the room. All eyes followed him as he stood and entered his plea. Not guilty. His lawyer, Mr. Doy, made it clear that their defense strategy would rest on claims of insanity. The prosecution wasted no time laying out a meticulous timeline of Gilbert's actions on the day Alice disappeared. Witness after witness was called. Alice's father, George Sterling, testified. Mrs. Tupper recounted seeing a man holding a little girl's hand along Savin Hill Avenue. Mrs. Harding described spotting a child and a man making their way toward the railroad depot. and railroad agent J.T. Loring gave his testimony, identifying Gilbert as the man he had seen with Alice. But the moment that shook the courtroom to its core came when Alice's mother, Mrs. Sterling, took the stand. As she turned to face Gilbert, seated just feet away in the defendant's dock, her grief erupted. With her voice trembling and her hands shaking, she cried out in anguish, "Upon my soul and heart, that man sitting there has killed my daughter, my darling child." Her words echoed through the silent chamber as she pointed directly at Gilbert. She wept openly, barely able to compose herself through questioning. Then, overcome by raw emotion, she broke down again, shouting, "He murdered her. My Alice, my angel child, he murdered her." In a fit of despair, she tried to lunge toward the dock to reach him, but a court officer restrained her. The scene was so powerful, so heartbreaking, that newspapers later described it as one of the most dramatic and tragic moments ever witnessed in that courthouse. In the wake of Mrs. Sterling's emotional outburst, Gilbert's attorney, Mr. Doy, immediately seized the moment. He stood and demanded a mistrial, arguing that her cries had poisoned the minds of the jury. After all, how could they remain impartial after such a heartbreaking and powerful accusation? The judges paused, considered the request, but ultimately denied it. The trial would go on. The defense then shifted its focus, bringing in witnesses from Nova Scotia who had known the Gilbert family for years. Their testimonies painted a troubling picture of his ancestry. They revealed that Gilbert's father struggled with alcoholism, while a maternal uncle had been confined to the Dartmouth Asylum since 1877. Two of his cousins were described as having intellectual disabilities, and an aunt suffered repeated bouts of religious melancholy and dementia. With this foundation laid, the defense brought in medical experts specializing in mental illness. Each one testified that after examining Gilbert, they were convinced he was insane. They argued that his mental condition made him incapable of understanding, let alone controlling his actions. According to them, Gilbert could not have fully comprehended the nature or the consequences of what he had done. These testimonies were delivered with precision and weight. By the time the experts stepped down, a murmur of uncertainty spread through the gallery. Spectators began whispering, questioning. The revelations about Gilbert's family history, combined with the confident words of medical professionals, left many in the courtroom unsettled. For the first time, doubt began to creep into what had seemed like a clear-cut case for the prosecution. The prosecution wasn't about to let the defense's insanity argument go unchallenged. They called in their own team of medical experts, who flatly rejected the claims. These doctors testified that Angus Gilbert had shown no signs of insanity at all. In their professional opinion, the crime could not have been the result of epilepsy or a sudden manic episode. They explained that each of them had spoken with Gilbert multiple times since his arrest, and none had observed any behavior that suggested he was mentally unsound. With the battle of experts concluded, the trial came to an end after 4 tense days. On June 28th, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom fell into anxious silence. Hours stretched, or at least it felt that way. In reality, the jury was gone for only 1 hour and 25 minutes. Then they returned, filing back into the chamber as the crowd held its breath. The verdict was clear. Guilty of first-degree murder. At the announcement, the gallery erupted into applause, though the celebration was quickly silenced by court officers. Order was restored as the judge rose to deliver the final words of justice. The sentence was death, execution by hanging. The case was appealed, giving Angus Gilbert one last chance at hope. In response, the governor ordered further medical evaluations to determine his sanity once and for all. Each report came back with the same conclusion. Gilbert was not insane. On the morning of February 21st, 1896, Gilbert attended a final religious service inside the prison, joined by his sister Jenny. Afterward, he was led calmly to the gallows. At exactly 10:40 a.m., the trapdoor was released, and Angus Gilbert was hanged. From the day of his arrest to the very end, Gilbert never confessed. He went to his death maintaining that he was innocent. Later that day, his body was released to his sister for burial. The murder of Alice Sterling was more than just a crime. It was a tragedy that sent waves of grief through her family and community, and a chilling reminder of how fragile innocence can be. Over a century later, her story still echoes, a haunting piece of history that reminds us of both the darkness people are capable of and the strength of those left behind. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. If this case moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next story, as we continue uncovering history's forgotten crimes together.